"Come on, hurry up!" the groom's uncle shouted, stepping right up to the bed. Aisha and Samir lay beneath the heavy bedspread, as if under someone else's sentence, afraid even to breathe. "What is this? Did you fall asleep in there?" An aunt snapped, her voice sharp as a knife. "We didn't come here to wait." The mother-in-law stood nearby with her arms crossed over her chest, watching coldly, without a trace of pity, like an inspection that had to be passed. "We don't need your feelings," the uncle barked. "We need proof. The family's honor, the dignity of the lineage," another woman echoed. The bedspread trembled. Aisha shrank as if pressed into the ground. Samir froze beside her. In that moment, he was not a man. He was a prisoner, just like she was. "Faster!" someone shouted again, right by the bed. "We have to see the sign." "Until there's a stain, you are not leaving this room," the mother-in-law said evenly, calmly. And that made it even more terrifying. Aisha felt the world narrow down to a single demand: a red sheet or disgrace. Before we continue, let's return to the beginning of this story, to the day when it all first began. Aisha woke up before dawn, not from noise, but from the feeling that someone was standing nearby. The room was half dark, yet the house was already breathing with unfamiliar footsteps. Somewhere a door creaked, fabric rustled, cups clinked softly. The smell of strong tea, fresh soap, and silk warmed by an iron blended into one heavy air. It didn't refresh, it pressed down. Aisha was 19. She lay staring at the ceiling, counting her breaths. Counting was easier than thinking. Today was her day. That's what everyone said. But inside, it sounded different. Today she would be handed over. The door opened without a knock. Women in headscarves entered. Aunts, cousins, neighbors. There were more of them than she had expected. They filled the room without asking permission, the way water fills a vessel, quickly into the brim. Someone adjusted the curtain, someone placed a stool, someone pulled the blanket off Aisha. Their hands worked confidently, as if they had rehearsed this many times before. "Get up," one of them said gently, but with the finality of a command. "It's time." Aisha stood. She was seated on the edge of the bed, a light shawl thrown over her shoulders. Her hair began to be combed. The comb pulled at her scalp, but Aisha didn't move. Help here meant control, where to turn her head, how to hold her shoulders, when to smile. No one asked if she was comfortable. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, steady, heavy. Aisha recognized them instantly. Her father. He entered and stopped at the doorway, as if checking whether everything was going according to plan. He scanned the room, the women, his daughter. His gaze lingered on her face, too calm, too pale. "Today you are responsible for the family's honor," he said without drama, like someone reciting a rule. "Remember that." Aisha lowered her eyes. She had heard these words her whole life, but today they felt cold, like metal. "Papa," she began, and immediately realized she didn't know how to finish the sentence. "Don't complicate things," he cut her off. "Do as you're told." He left. The women didn't fall silent. They continued as if nothing had happened. Aisha's silence became part of the process. Her mother stood by the wall, holding a tray with cups. Mariam moved quickly, soundlessly, avoiding her daughter's gaze. She served tea, straightened folds of fabric, checked knots, all without a word. Aisha caught her mother's eyes for just a moment. There was anxiety there, and exhaustion, but no decision. "Eat a little," Mariam said, sliding a cup closer. "You'll need strength." Aisha took a sip. The bitterness burned her tongue. She wanted to ask why, for what. What if I can't? But questions were dangerous. They could disrupt the order. Outside, lights and ribbons were already being hung. The celebration was assembling like a stage set. Women discussed guests and music. Men carried chairs. Laughter sounded too loud. Aisha sat as henna patterns appeared on her hands, neat, dark. The brush glided, leaving marks that could not be erased. "Smile," an aunt reminded her without looking up. "This isn't a funeral." Aisha smiled. It felt like an exercise for muscles. She stepped into the courtyard for a moment, to breathe the cool air. The sky was gray, as if the morning itself was uncertain. Her father stood by the gate again, speaking on the phone in short phrases. When he saw Aisha, he ended the call. "Watch your face," he said. "People are looking." I'm scared, she blurted out, surprising even herself. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Fear shame, he said. Everything else is bearable. The words stayed with her like a mark. He walked away, and Aisha stood there for a few seconds longer, feeling fear turn into something familiar. When she was led back into the house, the women closed around her like a corridor. She was seated, her headscarf adjusted, her jewelry checked. Everything had to be right. Aisha understood. Right had nothing to do with her. At one point, an aunt leaned toward her ear. The whisper was quick, practical, without emotion. Tonight everything will be decided in front of everyone. Aisha froze. She didn't ask who. The answer was obvious. In this house, decisions are not made by those they concern. The music outside grew louder. Guests began to arrive. Aisha sat, allowing them to do what they needed to do, and for the first time thought clearly. If everything was already decided, then only one thing was required of her, not to interfere. Her mother approached, adjusted the edge of her shawl, and let her hand rest on her daughter's shoulder a moment longer than necessary. It was the only touch that morning in which Aisha felt warmth. Endure it, Miriam whispered, and the words sounded like a plea without hope. Aisha nodded. She already knew that endurance here was a form of currency. It was promised in exchange for peace. The house buzzed, the celebration gained momentum, and Aisha felt her right to choose slowly leaving her. Not loudly, not suddenly, quietly, like the light being turned off in a room where you are still sitting. She straightened her back and smiled once more. That was exactly what was expected of her today. The hall shone as if it had been built not for people, but for being looked at. Light reflected off gold, glass, and stone. The music thundered confidently and loudly, drowning out any doubts. Everything here was calculated. The flowers, the seating, the smiles. A wealthy wedding is not a celebration. It's a demonstration. And Aisha felt herself as part of the display. She was led to the entrance the way an exhibit is presented, carefully, under control, without the right to stop. Cameras flashed immediately, men in expensive suits, women in heavy dresses and headscarves. Hundreds of guests, hundreds of eyes. Aisha took a step forward, trying not to look around. The dress weighed her down, the jewelry chilled her skin. She walked, thinking only of how to place her feet correctly so she wouldn't stumble and bring shame. Above all, not on herself. On the stage stood people from the groom's side. Aisha didn't see him at first, and when she did, she froze. Samir, her husband. He was taller than she had expected, restrained, composed. His suit fit perfectly, his face calm but tense, like someone who knew all eyes were on him and that he had no right to make a mistake. He looked at her as attentively as she looked at him. No smile, no warmth. Just the gaze of a man who had been told, "This is your wife." Aisha felt a strange sense of relief. He looked like a stranger too. It meant she wasn't the only one here against her will. "Closer," the photographer ordered. "Here, one more step." They were placed next to each other, literally moved like objects, so the frame would be even. Aisha caught the scent of his cologne, cool, expensive. Samir didn't touch her, but the distance between them was too small to pretend they weren't connected. "Smile," the photographer said again. Aisha smiled. Samir did the same, briefly, without involving his eyes. Someone in the hall clapped, someone laughed. The music grew louder. Everything looked right, and that was what frightened her the most. Aisha noticed a woman in a dark green outfit seated closest to the stage. She wasn't smiling, wasn't applauding, wasn't distracted. Her gaze was fixed only on them. There was no curiosity in it, only evaluation. Her mother-in-law. She stood up and walked toward the stage confidently, as if this were her home. And, in truth, it was. She stepped up and stood very close. Aisha felt something tighten inside her. The woman examined her slowly, carefully, from head to toe. Not the dress, the face, the eyes, the posture, the way one looks at an item that might be kept, or returned. "Beautiful," she said at last. "Too quiet?" Aisha lowered her eyes. That was the correct response. Samir tensed, barely noticeably. But he said nothing. "In our house, we value order," the mother-in-law continued, lowering her voice. "And we don't like surprises." She took Aisha by the chin, gently but firmly, and turned her face toward the light. Aisha froze. Someone in the hall laughed, someone whispered, "Mashallah." The mother-in-law smiled at the guests, as if she had just paid a compliment. "Good," she said, stepping back. "We'll see." The words, "we'll see," hung in the air heavier than the music. The photo session continued. Aisha was turned, seated, lifted. Samir followed instructions without asking questions. Sometimes he glanced toward where his mother was sitting, and Aisha saw him nod, barely perceptibly. Agreement was his natural state. "You okay?" he asked quietly when the photographer turned away. Aisha nodded. Words were unnecessary. Guests came up to congratulate them, leaving behind smiles and glances. Aisha caught fragments of conversation. "She's young, so modest. The main thing is that everything is proper." The word proper echoed again and again, like a refrain. Aisha began to understand. Today they weren't celebrating the union of two people. They were celebrating obedience to rules. The music changed, dishes were replaced, but the tension never eased. Samir barely ate or drank. He sat straight, staring ahead, as if waiting for an exam. Aisha sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, feeling exhaustion rise from within. The mother-in-law approached again, this time without a smile. "Aisha," she said quietly, "come here." Aisha stood. Her heart was racing. The mother-in-law led her a step aside, close enough that the guests could see them together, but not hear. "Remember this," she said calmly. "In our house, everything must be proper." Aisha nodded. No other answer existed. The mother-in-law stepped back and turned to the guests again, as if the conversation were over. Aisha returned to her seat. Samir didn't look at her. The music grew louder. The celebration continued. The display sparkled. But inside, Aisha already knew the real test was still ahead. Today's smiles were only the facade. Behind it were rules that are never discussed. She sat beside a man she had seen for the first time in her life and understood. Their marriage hadn't begun with a conversation, nor with a choice. It had begun with an evaluation. The celebration gathered momentum. The music grew louder, the lights brighter, the laughter more confident. People relaxed, as if the most important part was already over. Aisha sat beside Samir and felt that the laughter passed right through her without touching her. She was here, and at the same time, not here. Women in headscarves gathered in small groups, changed places, leaned toward one another. Outwardly, congratulations. Inwardly, conversations not meant for her ears. Aisha tried not to listen, but the words found her anyway. "She's young, so quiet. We'll see tonight." She clenched her fingers in the folds of her dress. The word tonight was repeated more often than any other. It didn't sound like a promise. It sounded like a condition. Samir sat upright, his shoulders tense. He barely looked at her. His gaze kept returning to where a tall man with a heavy face stood, his uncle, the elder of the family, the one whose opinion mattered more than music and smiles. Samir's uncle approached often. He spoke quietly, but Samir nodded immediately every time. Aisha noticed it again and again, the brief tilt of the head, agreement without words, as if Samir were constantly submitting some kind of internal report. "Are you tired?" he finally asked, without looking at her. "No," Aisha replied. It was easier than explaining. He nodded, as if that were exactly the answer he expected. An aunt from the groom's side approached them, a woman with a sharp gaze and a soft voice. "Beautiful wedding," she said, looking at Aisha. "Everything is just as it should be." Aisha smiled. Samir said nothing. "The main thing is that everything continues to be proper," the aunt added, then walked away, leaving behind a chill in the air. Aisha caught her mother's gaze across the hall. Mariam sat upright, smiling at the woman beside her, but her eyes were anxious. She didn't come closer, as if she knew she had no right to interfere. Suddenly, Aisha understood clearly. Everyone here had their place, and her place was to remain silent. The music changed, dancing began. Women stood up, clapped their hands, laughed. Aisha noticed how some of them glanced in her direction, evaluating. Not the dress, not the hairstyle. Something else. something that would happen later. "They're talking," Aisha whispered, leaning towards Samir. "About the night." He stiffened. "Don't listen," he replied quickly. "Just stay calm." "And you?" she asked. Samir hesitated for a moment. Then he looked toward where his uncle stood. "Everything will be as it should be." The words didn't sound like confidence. They sounded like protection. Loud, deliberate laughter burst behind her. Two women were speaking openly without trying to hide it. "The mother-in-law is strict, but fair. Yes, they have order. They check everything." Aisha felt her heart speed up. She wanted to stand, to leave, to hide at least in the hallway. But she knew she couldn't. She couldn't look weak. She couldn't disrupt the picture. Samir stood when his uncle approached him. They stepped a few paces aside. Aisha watched them from where she sat. The uncle spoke quietly, but harshly. Samir listened with his head lowered. "You understand," Aisha caught a fragment. "This is not a small thing." Samir nodded. "I understand," he replied. The uncle studied him carefully, as if checking. "Without proof, you will disgrace the family," he said louder now, no longer caring who might hear. Aisha flinched. The words struck harder than if they had been said directly to her. She saw Samir go pale. "I know," Samir said. "Everything will be done." The uncle nodded in satisfaction and walked away, leaving behind a silence in which Samir stood for several seconds without moving. When he returned, Aisha looked at him. He didn't meet her eyes. "They're waiting," he said quietly. "We'll need to leave soon." Aisha nodded. Her throat was dry. The celebration continued, but for her, time seemed to compress. Every laugh sounded louder, every whisper closer. Aisha felt like she was under glass, an exhibit being observed until the moment of inspection. The mother-in-law passed by and stopped for a second. She looked at Aisha as if she already knew the answer to every question. "Everything is going well," she said, and moved on. Aisha didn't respond. She stared at her hands covered in henna and thought about how easily smiles fade, and how hard expectations are to erase. Suddenly the music fell silent for a brief moment. A track change. In that short pause, Aisha clearly heard someone whisper, "We'll know soon." She straightened her back. Beside her, Samir took a deep breath, as if gathering strength. "Aisha," he said, using her name for the first time, "just do what they tell you." She looked at him and understood. He was afraid no less than she was, but his fear was different, the fear of not being enough. When the music started again, Aisha already knew. The laughter would end with the celebration. And the whispers would grow loud. The corridor was longer than Aisha had expected. The music from the hall faded gradually, as if being cut away by layers of fabric. Footsteps grew dull, the light softened, and became more dangerous. She walked beside Samir, feeling that they were being led, not accompanied, but led, with the pace and direction set for them. The bedroom door had been opened in advance. Large, dark wood, carved, something to admire on another day. Today, it looked like an entrance to a place where questions were not asked. They crossed the threshold, and Aisha understood immediately. This was not privacy. This was a stage. There were already people in the room. The uncle stood at the head of the bed, his hands folded. Two aunts stood on opposite sides, like guards. The mother-in-law was closest of all, wearing an expression of calm certainty, as if everything here belonged to her. No one was leaving. No one pretended this was temporary. "Close the door," the mother-in-law said. The door was closed. The sound was short and final. Aisha felt her throat tighten. She looked at Samir. He stood beside her, shoulders tense, eyes lowered. He didn't protest. Protest was impossible here. "Everything as it should be," the uncle said, scanning the room. "No unnecessary movements." One of the aunts approached the bed and unfolded a thick bedspread. The heavy fabric was laid on top, concealing everything beneath it. It was strange, to hide and at the same time demand. Aisha understood. The bedspread was not for modesty, but for control, so no one could see, but everyone would know what was happening. "Sit," the mother-in-law said. Aisha took a step, then another. The bed was large, neatly made. The flowers on the nightstand smelled too strong. She sat on the edge, feeling the fabric of her dress press against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Samir sat beside her. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the floor, as if it were safer there. "Don't drag this out," an aunt said. "Time is passing." Aisha wanted to say she was scared. She wanted to ask the women to leave, even just for a moment. She wanted to say something, but the words didn't come. It was as if they had stayed behind the door with the music. The mother-in-law stepped closer. "You understand," she said to Aisha softly, almost gently. "Everything here is decided once." Aisha nodded. It was easier than explaining that she understood far too well. The uncle cleared his throat. "We're here to make sure there are no mistakes," he said. "Proceed." The room seemed to shrink. The walls felt closer. Aisha felt the weight of their gazes, even with her eyes lowered. She felt every presence, like pressure on her skin. The bedspread was lifted and carefully draped so as to hide them from view. The fabric fell heavily, cutting off the light. Aisha found herself in semi-darkness, beside a man who was her husband by documents, but a stranger in truth. Samir began, and fell silent. Aisha turned her face toward him. Under the bedspread it was cramped, hot. She could see his profile, tense, unfamiliar. "Do it!" a voice came from outside. "We're waiting." Aisha closed her eyes. She felt her hands shaking. Inside, everything tightened, as if her body were trying to protect itself from what was happening. "Faster," an aunt added. "This shouldn't take long." Samir took a deep breath. Aisha felt it in the movement beside her. He was afraid too, not of her, but of what would happen if they failed to meet expectations. Under the bedspread, it was quiet. Outside, it wasn't. They spoke, whispered, commented. Every word pierced through the fabric like a needle. "Everything must be proper," the mother-in-law repeated. Aisha understood then. This room truly had no walls. Because there were no boundaries here. Not for eyes, not for words, not for expectations. Time stretched strangely. Seconds felt longer than minutes. Aisha sensed the tension growing, not only inside her, but throughout the room. The people outside were waiting, not for a result, for a sign. "Well," the uncle said impatiently. Aisha felt cold rise from her feet. She wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the fabric, to become invisible. "Begin," the command came. "Don't delay." The words left no space to breathe. They were a point beyond which there was no turning back. Aisha gripped the edge of the bedspread and understood. Everything before this had been preparation. What was real began now. Aisha was trembling so hard it seemed to her they could hear it outside, through the thick bedspread. The fabric lay like a heavy dome, cutting off the light while amplifying the voices. Beneath it, the air was tight and suffocating. Outside was the space where her fate was being decided. Samir sat beside her, motionless. His breathing was uneven, sharp, like that of a man cornered. He didn't look at Aisha. She could see only his profile, tense, unfamiliar. In that moment, there was no closeness between them, no trust, only shared pressure. "Do it," the uncle's voice came. "We're waiting." Aisha closed her eyes. She tried to remember something, anything, that might help her hold on. Her mother's voice, the smell of home, any image where she was still herself. But everything dissolved under the weight of expectation. "Don't disgrace us," an aunt added. "This is your duty." The word duty sounded like a sentence. Aisha nodded, not because she agreed, but because she didn't know how to do anything else. "Here," no one asked. "Here," they demanded. Samir made a movement, as if he wanted to say something. Then he stopped. He knew any word could become a mistake. He nodded in response to another order, as if surrendering in advance. "Hurry," the mother-in-law said impatiently. "Time is passing." Aisha felt time passing, not forward, but downward, like sand. Every second was a test, every pause, an accusation. Under the bedspread it was quiet, but the silence brought no relief. It was filled with whispers cutting through the fabric. "They're taking too long. This isn't how it should be. What's happening?" Aisha clenched the edge of the bedspread. Her fingers turned white. She wanted to say please to anyone, but here that word meant nothing. Do as you were told, an aunt hissed. Don't complicate things. Samir nodded again. His shoulders tightened even more. Aisha felt his fear, not of her, but of the consequences. Fear of failing, of not proving himself, of not meeting expectations. It must happen, the uncle said harshly. We won't wait forever. And suddenly Aisha understood clearly. They weren't waiting for her. They were waiting for a sign. She was only the path to it. Minutes passed, or more. Aisha lost track of time. Beneath the bedspread it grew hotter, while outside it grew more impatient. Well, someone asked, is there anything? There was no answer. Aisha felt emptiness and fear slowly turning into numbness. She did everything she was told. She didn't argue, she didn't resist. She simply complied. Samir exhaled sharply and froze. Aisha opened her eyes and looked at him. His face was pale. What's going on? An aunt asked. Why is this taking so long? Go on, the uncle said. Don't drag it out. Aisha wanted to disappear. Her body no longer belonged to her. It had become an object of expectation. More time passed. Outside, the whispers grew louder, the words sharper. If there isn't, that's bad. That doesn't happen. Aisha felt cold rising inside her. She understood what was happening, and that realization was more terrifying than any shouting. Where is the sign? The mother-in-law asked calmly. Too calmly. There was no answer again. Samir shifted half a step away. Aisha saw his hands shaking. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring somewhere to the side, as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. You understand, the uncle said, no longer hiding his irritation. Without it, you will disgrace all of us. Samir remained silent. Aisha heard someone step closer beyond the bedspread. A shadow slid across the fabric. Time is passing, the mother-in-law repeated, and there is no sign. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Aisha felt something inside her break. She had done everything she could, everything they demanded of her, and it still wasn't enough. Under the bedspread, it became completely quiet. Even Samir's breathing seemed to slow. Aisha understood. Not only this night was being decided now, her place was being decided. And if there was no sign, no explanations would save her. Outside, a sharp breath was heard. Someone said in a low voice, "This isn't how it should be." Aisha closed her eyes. She waited. Not for a sign, but for the consequences. The silence didn't last long. It snapped sharply like a stretched thread breaking. "What are you doing in there?" an aunt shouted, her voice striking the bedspread like a drum. "Stop staying silent." Aisha flinched. She was still beneath the heavy fabric, as if under a crushing sky. Tears ran down her cheeks quietly, without sound. Crying wasn't allowed here, but her body didn't ask permission. "This isn't right," one of the women said. "This doesn't happen. Do you understand what's happening?" The uncle's voice turned hard, dry. He was addressing Samir. "Do you understand how this will end?" Samir stood motionless. Aisha felt it even through the bedspread, his stillness like a stone beside her. He said nothing, and that silence angered them more than any words. "Answer me," the uncle raised his voice. "Are you a man or not?" The mother-in-law stepped closer. Aisha recognized her steps, calm, confident. She wasn't shouting, and that made it more frightening. "Don't put on a performance," she said coldly. "Do what you're supposed to do." Aisha shrank inward. She felt small, almost invisible. Beneath the bedspread, there was no air, no time, only waiting, heavy and sticky. "Is she mocking us?" an aunt said. "Or is it you?" "That's enough," the uncle cut in. "Time is up." Aisha felt the bedspread shift slightly. Light rushed into the room, harsh, merciless. She squeezed her eyes shut. The tears became instantly visible. "Look at her," the aunt said. "She won't even look up." Aisha wanted to raise her eyes. She wanted to say something, but the words refused to come. They were stuck somewhere deep, buried under fear. "Say something," the uncle demanded. Samir stepped forward. His voice was hoarse. "Give us one more minute," he said. "Please." "A minute?" the aunt scoffed. "You've already had all the minutes you're getting." The mother-in-law studied him carefully, as if weighing him. Do you understand that without this sign, you will disgrace our house? She said calmly. Are you ready for that? Samir didn't answer. His silence was the answer. Aisha cried harder. Tears fell onto the fabric, leaving dark spots that dried almost immediately. She felt guilty, though she didn't know for what exactly. For a body that wouldn't obey commands, for expectations that turned out stronger than reality. Remove the bedspread, the aunt said. We need to see. No, the mother-in-law said sharply. Leave it. Aisha heard whispering. The women spoke openly now, no longer hiding their irritation. This doesn't happen. This is shameful. What will people say? The uncle raised his voice again. Samir, this is your responsibility. Do you understand what's being decided right now? Samir closed his eyes. Aisha saw the movement. He looked broken, not angry, terrified. I understand, he said quietly. Then do it, the uncle ordered. The room felt suffocating with expectation. Aisha felt every look, every word pressing her into the bed more firmly than the bedspread ever could. She no longer felt time, only fear, steady, constant. The mother-in-law stepped closer and spoke almost in a whisper. We are not here for your feelings. We are here for order. Aisha pressed her lips together. She understood. There was no place for explanations here, only demand. And then, a sharp inhale, not Aisha's, Samir's. She felt movement beside her. At first, she didn't understand what was happening. Then, the smell, metallic, sharp. What are you doing? An aunt asked sharply. There was no answer. Aisha opened her eyes. She saw a red stain slowly appearing on the white fabric beneath the bedspread. At first small, almost invisible, then spreading wider, the room fell silent, truly silent, deafeningly so. There is... One of the women exhaled. The mother-in-law leaned closer, her gaze cold and precise. Finally, she said. Aisha stared at the stain and didn't understand what she felt. Relief, horror, emptiness, all at once. Someone straightened quickly. That's enough, the uncle said. It's done. They began to pull the bedspread aside. The women exchanged looks. A sense of victory hung in the air. Not joy, but confirmation. Aisha lay still. She knew this stain would become her fate, not her truth, but her pass. And she still didn't know what price she would have to pay for it. Aisha didn't understand right away what had happened. She simply lay there, feeling the air in the room change, lighter, louder, more alive. As if someone had suddenly opened a window after long suffocation, only that window hadn't been opened for her. There is, the aunt repeated, louder now, and for the first time that evening, there was joy in her voice. There is! The word sounded like a victory, like confirmation that everything was proper. And immediately, as if on cue, the room came alive. Women began speaking all at once, whispers turning into excited breaths. Someone clapped their hands, someone laughed, short and sharp, like after a successful deal. Her mother-in-law, Rabia, stood closest. She didn't smile broadly or show open emotion, but Aisha saw what she had feared most: satisfaction. Quiet, cold, as if all this time Rabia had not been waiting for her son's happiness, but for proof of control. Finally, she said, reaching toward the fabric as if collecting a stamped document. Aisha tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't respond. Her head was empty. She felt not like a person, but like a place where a check had been carried out. She wanted to cover her face with her hands, but her hands were shaking. Samir sat beside her with his head lowered. He looked neither at Aisha nor at the stain. His shoulders were tense, as if he were holding himself together to keep from collapsing. He looked like a man who had just been forced to do something he would hate himself for all his life. Aunt Shahina grabbed the edge of the sheet first. The movement was fast, confident, almost greedy. Give it here, she said. Careful now. But there was no care. The sheet was pulled, shifted, lifted. The white fabric with the red stain ended up in several women's hands at once, like a trophy. Aisha felt nausea rise in her throat. She wanted to scream, "Don't touch it!" But she couldn't. Brides don't scream here. Brides endure. "Mashallah," one of the women said. Everything as it should be. Thank God, another added. I was already thinking. She didn't finish the sentence, but Aisha knew the rest anyway. That she was bad, that she wasn't right, that she would bring shame. The uncle stood at the head of the bed, his face calm. But that calm was frightening. The calm of a judge who has passed a sentence and is satisfied that everything matched the rules. That's enough, he said. No more talking. He looked at Samir, and in that look, there was no warmth, no pride. There was a demand. You did it. Samir nodded, quietly, almost imperceptibly, like someone who passed an exam and lost himself. Aisha felt numb. She stared at one point and listened as the room celebrated not their union, but the fact that everything turned out properly. No one asked how she was. No one noticed her tears. Her condition didn't matter. What mattered was the stain. The mother-in-law lifted the fabric higher to inspect it more closely. Aisha saw Rabia narrow her eyes, assessing whether it was visible enough. And that detail made Aisha feel especially sick. Even proof had to be convincing. Good, the mother-in-law said. Now we can go out. Aisha heard the women begin to move. Someone adjusted a headscarf, someone smoothed their clothes, as if they were leaving not after humiliation, but after an ordinary tea gathering. There was no embarrassment in their movements. For them, this was normal. For them, this was tradition. Aunt Shahina leaned toward Aisha and said almost gently, "Now you're accepted." Aisha didn't answer. The word accepted sounded like mercy, as if she might not have been accepted, as if she should be grateful she hadn't been destroyed. Samir finally lifted his gaze, but not toward Aisha. He was looking at the fabric in the women's hands. His eyes were empty. And in that emptiness, Aisha saw not cruelty, but collapse. The uncle stepped forward and took the sheet from the women's hands, as if putting a final point on everything. He held it firmly, like a banner. "We'll show everyone," he said. Aisha inhaled sharply. Those words struck harder than all the shouting before. "Why?" escaped her, barely audible. No one answered, because the question was unnecessary, because the answer was obvious, so everyone would know. So it would be fixed. So there would be no doubts. So her life would forever become part of their version of what is proper. The mother-in-law looked at Aisha and said calmly, without anger, "This is how it's done." The door was opened. Noise from the hall rushed into the corridor. Music, laughter, conversations. The celebration continued as if nothing had happened, as if this had been nothing more than a formality. Aisha sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the fabric of her dress, and understood. Her humiliation was about to be carried out there, to the guests, like a trophy of victory, and she would not be able to stop it. Samir stood up. He still didn't look at her. He looked like he wanted to disappear, but disappearing wasn't allowed. Here, no one disappears. The uncle went out first, holding the sheet. Behind him, the mother-in-law and the aunts, already smiling. Aisha was left alone in the room for 1 second. 1 second, without voices, without commands. And in that second she felt something inside her die. Not honor, not dignity, but the sense that she belonged to herself. Then the door opened slightly again, and an aunt said, "Come, don't linger." Aisha stood up, and she went. The music hit the hall before Aisha could even understand where she was. The doors flew open, and light crashed over her like a wave. Laughter, applause, the clinking of dishes, everything returned instantly, as if there had been no pause at all, as if nothing had happened behind those doors except a brief formality. The uncle stepped out first. He held the sheet high and steady, like a banner, white fabric, on which everyone saw only one thing. Aisha followed half a step behind, like a shadow. Her heart beat dully, as if underwater. "Mashallah" came from several directions at once. The guests stood. Some applauded, some smiled, some leaned toward their neighbors to whisper their opinions. Aisha caught fragments of phrases like the sound of rain. "That's how it should be." A real one. "Everything's right." The word real was repeated most often. It sounded like a stamp, like permission to exist. Aisha walked and thought that until this moment she had been like a draft, something that could be crumpled up and thrown away. And now, an approved version. Her mother-in-law, Rabia, rose from her seat and smiled at the guests. The smile was wide, confident, proprietary. "Thank you all," she said loudly. "We're glad everything went with dignity." The word dignity rang especially clearly. Aisha stood nearby and felt strangers' eyes slide over her. Not her face, not her dress, but deeper, inspecting, accepting, claiming. Samir stood beside her, yet as if at a distance. His face was motionless, his eyes lowered. He looked neither at the sheet nor at the guests. Aisha caught herself thinking that in that moment he felt like the most distant person in the hall. "The bride!" someone from the relatives shouted. "Let her step forward!" Aisha took a step, then another. The dress got in the way. Her legs felt heavy. She felt exposed, not as a woman, but as proof. "So modest," an elderly woman in the front row said. "You can tell she's proper." "A real one," another repeated, nodding as if ticking a box. Aisha lowered her eyes. It was safer than looking at them. They spoke as if before this moment she had been unreal, as if human worth were measured by a stain on fabric. The music grew louder. Someone started clapping again. The sheet was lifted higher so everyone could see. Aisha felt nausea rise in her throat. She wanted to turn away, to cover her face, but she stood straight. She had been taught this since morning. Hold yourself together. "Thank God," a man in an expensive suit said. "A good family." Aisha heard someone whisper behind her. "Now we can relax." She didn't understand what relax meant. Relax for whom? For them? Yes. For her? No. The mother-in-law approached Aisha and took her hand, squeezed it firmly, almost painfully. Smiling at the guests, she said quietly, so only Aisha could hear, "Now everything is in its place." Aisha nodded. She already knew what her place was. Here, under these gazes, within these rules. Samir finally lifted his eyes. For a second, their gazes met. There was no joy in his eyes. There was something else. Exhaustion, emptiness, fear. He quickly looked away. "Dancing!" someone shouted. "Let the celebration continue." The music switched to a faster rhythm. Women stood up and began to spin. Laughter grew louder. The sheet was moved aside, but not hidden. It was placed in plain sight, like a trophy, like proof of success. Aisha stood there and felt the hall slowly absorbing her. Every round of applause sounded like confirmation that everything had been done correctly. No one doubted. No one asked questions. "You did well," an aunt said as she passed by. "You endured it." Endured. The word cut sharply. Aisha suddenly understood. They hadn't expected happiness from her. They had expected endurance. From the crowd came a loud voice, cutting through the music. "Now she's ours." The phrase sounded confident, almost joyful. Several people laughed, some nodded. Aisha froze. Those words struck hardest of all. Not wife, not part of the family. Ours. She felt something inside her finally tighten. Not break. Tighten. Compress into a small, dense knot that had to be hidden deep inside to survive. The mother-in-law nodded with satisfaction when she heard the words. The uncle smiled for the first time that evening. The celebration was saved. Tradition. Confirmed. Aisha stood in the middle of the hall, surrounded by music and light, and understood. She had been accepted. But not her. They had accepted the sign, accepted conformity, and she simply remained beside it, like a shell. The music went on, guests danced, applause didn't fade, and for the first time, Aisha clearly felt it. Her life no longer belonged to her. It belonged to this hall, these words, this ours. And that was more terrifying than the silence. After the applause came silence, not all at once but gradually, like the noise fading after a storm. The celebration continued, but Aisha felt it clearly. Her part was over. The music had become background noise, and what mattered now happened in the half-tones, in gestures, glances, short phrases that set the rules. She was led aside almost imperceptibly, not by an order, by a hand motion, a light touch to her elbow. Her mother-in-law, Rabia, walked beside her, confident and calm. Aisha followed, keeping her back straight. The dress was still heavy, but now it felt like a uniform, not festive, but functional. "Sit here," Rabia said, pointing to a couch against the wall. Aisha sat down. Women surrounded her. Aunts, relatives, elders. They didn't look directly at her, but their presence formed a dense ring. Each of them knew why she was there. "Now listen," one of the ants said quietly. "This is important." Aisha nodded. "Speak only when you're asked," another continued. "Don't interrupt." "Keep your eyes down," a third added, "especially around men." "If you don't understand something, stay silent," a fourth said. "Ask me later." The phrases fell one after another, like items on an instruction list. Aisha caught each one, memorized them, stacked them neatly in her mind. There were no threats, none were needed. Acceptance had already happened, and with it, obligation. Samir stood a little distance away. He was looking off to the side, as if studying a pattern on the wall. His face was calm, almost detached. When addressed, he answered briefly and agreed immediately. "You understand?" the uncle asked. "Yes," Samir replied. "Be attentive," the uncle said. "Order in a house doesn't maintain itself." Samir nodded. Aisha noticed his jaw tighten, then relax. The habit of agreeing was stronger than any inner resistance. "You are the lady of the house now," an ant told Aisha. "But remember, the lady is not the one in charge." Aisha nodded again. "You wake up early," they continued. "The house likes quiet. Don't go out without permission. Don't say more than necessary." Each rule was simple. Together, they formed a cage. The celebration ended closer to night. Guests left, the music faded. Aisha was taken to a room that now looked different, not like a stage, but like a place of permanent residence. The flowers on the nightstand wilted faster than she had expected. Samir entered after her. He closed the door and remained standing. A few seconds of silence passed. "You're tired," he said finally. "Yes," Aisha replied. "It will be easier this way," he added, looking away. She wanted to ask, "Easier for whom?" But she didn't. She already knew the answer. That night, Aisha didn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the house, the creaking floors, footsteps, whispers behind the wall. The house was alive, testing whether she would adjust. She was adjusting, slowly, cautiously, like to a new kind of pain. In the morning, her mother-in-law came. Rabia sat across from her, hands folded in her lap. Her voice was calm even. "You did what you were supposed to do," she said. "And we noticed." Aisha lowered her eyes. "Remember this," Rabia continued. "Acceptance has a price." Aisha stayed silent. "You are part of our house now," the mother-in-law said. "But a part must match the whole." She paused and looked Aisha straight in the eyes, for the first time without a smile. "We accepted you for that," she said quietly. The words hung between them. Aisha felt something tighten inside her, but not break. She understood. Acceptance was not about love or respect. It was about a condition that could not be violated. "I understand," Aisha said. The mother-in-law nodded and stood. "Good." When she left, Aisha remained seated alone. The room was quiet, familiar, and foreign at the same time. She looked at her hands. The henna patterns were beginning to fade. The traces of the celebration were disappearing. The rules were not. Samir came in later, silently. He sat on the edge of the bed without looking at her. "Don't make mistakes," he said. "It will be easier that way." Aisha nodded. She already knew. Here, ease is measured by the absence of noise. She lay down, closed her eyes, and for the first time thought clearly, acceptance is not the end of the trials, it is their beginning. Days in the new house didn't begin. They switched on. Aisha woke up not by time, but by sound. Footsteps in the kitchen, the quiet clink of dishes, the rustle of headscarves. No one woke you with words here. You were expected to hear and rise on your own. The first morning was the hardest, not because of exhaustion, but because of the silence. No one said good morning. No one asked how she slept. Her mother-in-law passed by, gave the slightest nod, and that was enough for Aisha to understand. She was expected to follow. She learned the house the way one learns a language without a dictionary, where you're allowed to stand, where you shouldn't linger, when to lower your eyes, when to stay silent, even if something inside is tearing its way out. Mistakes here weren't forgiven, but they weren't punished loudly either. They were remembered. If Aisha placed a cup in the wrong spot, no one corrected her. The cup was simply moved without a word. If she started speaking when she wasn't asked, the conversation continued as if she weren't there. Silence pressed harder than shouting. It was precise and cold, like an instrument. Samir barely spoke. He left early, returned late, ate quickly and in silence. When Aisha tried to ask him something, he would raise his hand slightly and say, "Later." But later never came. He was present in body and absent entirely. Aisha noticed how he looked at his mother, attentively, expectantly, like someone used to checking his life against someone else's decision. "This is how it's done here," he said once, when Aisha finally couldn't hold it in anymore and asked why she wasn't allowed to go into the courtyard alone. "Don't ask unnecessary questions." She nodded. The word unnecessary became a stop sign for her. People spoke quietly in the house, but Aisha heard a lot. Whispers behind the wall, half sentences in the kitchen, restrained chuckles that stopped the moment she appeared in a doorway. She became sensitive to intonation, like to the weather. From it, she could tell whether the day would be calm. Her mother-in-law observed from a distance. She didn't interfere, didn't raise her voice. Sometimes she came closer and said briefly, almost casually, "That's not how it's done. Remember? That's not customary here." Each phrase settled onto Aisha like another layer. She felt the desire to explain, justify, or ask slowly disappear. It was easier to conform. One day Aisha couldn't hold it in and cried, quietly, in the bathroom, pressing a towel to her mouth. The tears came fast, uncontrollable. She wasn't crying from pain, she was crying from compression. From having to shrink a little more every day. When she came out, her mother-in-law was standing in the hallway, watching attentively, without judgment. "Tears are not a solution," she said calmly. "Endurance is valued here." Aisha lowered her eyes and walked past. She began to fear not people, but words, especially one word. Shame hovered in the house like a warning. It wasn't said often, but Aisha felt it was always nearby. Make a mistake, and it would be brought back. She became painfully careful, counted her steps, checked her facial expression and reflections, learned to say yes in a way that carried not even a trace of doubt. Several days passed, or weeks. Aisha stopped telling the difference. The house became familiar, the way a cage becomes familiar to a bird if it's never let out. One day she was carrying a tray of tea and stopped by the living room door when she heard voices. She hadn't meant to listen. She simply froze and heard. "Still, we were lucky," an aunt said. "Things are calm now." "Of course," someone replied. "If there hadn't been a sign, she wouldn't be here." The phrase was said casually, without malice, like a statement of fact. Aisha felt the tray grow heavier in her hands. She stood there without moving until the words settled inside her. They didn't wound. They explained. If there hadn't been a sign, she wouldn't be here. Not she wouldn't have been accepted. Not she would have been pitied. She wouldn't be here. Aisha slowly inhaled and exhaled. Then she knocked and entered as if nothing had happened, set down the tray, lowered her eyes. No one noticed anything unusual, but inside, something finally fell into place. She understood. Her presence here was conditional, temporary, dependent not on her, but on conformity, on how long she could remain proper. That night, Aisha lay staring into the darkness. Samir slept beside her, turned away. The house breathed. She listened and thought not about escape, but about survival. Here, you didn't need to run. Here, you needed not to stand out. Aisha closed her eyes and made a decision, quiet, without words. She would live the way they expected her to, not because she agreed, but because no one lives here any other way. The silence accepted her choice. The years didn't arrive suddenly. They settled, like dust that lays down in a thin layer every day, until one day you stop noticing it altogether. Aisha stopped counting time. She measured life in tasks. How many cups, how many steps, how many silences. The house was no longer hostile. It became familiar, and familiarity is the most reliable form of submission. Aisha was not beaten. She was not insulted out loud. She was not thrown out. She was allowed to stay. It sounded like mercy, and at the same time, like a sentence. She woke before everyone else. She knew when to put the tea on, when to leave the kitchen, when she was allowed to speak, and when it was better to disappear into the next room. She learned to move quietly, speak briefly, look in a way that never let her gaze linger on anyone's face for more than a second. Sometimes she caught herself doing everything automatically, as if her body lived separately from her thoughts. Thoughts were dangerous. They asked questions, and questions were not welcomed here. Samir didn't change all at once. At first he tried to remain neutral, then convenient. He became exactly what was expected of him, calm, restrained, obedient to family rules. He was not cruel, he simply didn't choose. There were no conversations between them about the past, and none about the future, only the present, quiet, orderly, without sharp edges. "It's calmer this way," Samir said once, when Aisha finally asked why he never argued with his mother. "Why complicate things?" Aisha nodded. She knew calm in this house was a currency, and it was paid for with silence. Sometimes Samir looked at her for a long time, as if he wanted to say something, but the words never came. He turned away, and the day continued. Aisha stopped waiting for those words. Her mother-in-law, Rabia, observed from a distance. She rarely intervened directly, but her presence was always felt, like a shadow cast by a wall. Sometimes she approached, said a few sentences, and left. "You've become calmer," she said once. "That's good." Aisha understood. Calmer meant less visible. The years made Aisha convenient. She no longer cried in the bathroom. The tears disappeared on their own, the way a skill disappears when it's never used. In their place came numbness. It was easier to live with. She learned how to disappear inside herself. Inside, there remained a small space, quiet, closed, where there were no gazes and no evaluations. Sometimes she remembered who she had been before, but those memories grew paler with time. New women appeared in the house, daughters-in-law, guests, distant relatives. Aisha looked at them and immediately understood who would walk the path faster, who would ask questions, and who wouldn't. She no longer judged. Judgment required strength. Sometimes that night surfaced in conversation. Not directly, between the lines. "Girls are different now," the women would say. "But before, everything was clear. It's good that back then, everything was done properly." Aisha heard these words while standing at the stove or setting the table. No one looked at her in those moments, but the words always reached her. She understood. Her life in this house was not held together by love, not by respect, not even by marriage. It was held together by proof that had once been shown to everyone. And that proof had forever become her biography. One day, many years later, Aisha was sitting in the courtyard watching leaves fall. Suddenly she caught herself on a strange thought. She no longer knew what she wanted, not because she couldn't, but because she had stopped asking herself. Her mother-in-law approached quietly as always. "You handle things well," she said. "The house is satisfied." Aisha lowered her eyes. "Remember this," Rabia continued, her voice dropping slightly. "Remember why you are here." The phrase was not a threat. It was a reminder. The strongest form of power. Aisha nodded. She did remember. Every day. And that memory held her in place better than any locks. That evening, Samir came home late. He sat down beside her, ate in silence, stood up. "Are you tired?" he asked almost automatically. "No," Aisha replied. He nodded. The conversation ended before it truly began. That night, Aisha lay listening to the house. It was calm, satisfied, confident. She knew she would not be thrown out, not hit, not broken suddenly. She would simply be allowed to stay, day after day, year after year, until she fully matched expectations. And Aisha understood. This was the price of acceptance, paid long ago, with no possibility of change. Aisha lives in this house as if she has always been here, as if her past were a dream that is not meant to be remembered. Morning begins the same way every day. She wakes before everyone else, quietly, so the door doesn't creak, so a cup doesn't clink. She cooks, arranges, cleans. Her movements are precise, practiced, without unnecessary gestures. In this house, neatness is valued, not as a trait, but as a guarantee of calm. She speaks little, not because she has nothing to say, but because words here require permission. Aisha has learned to read pauses. When it's acceptable to answer yes, when it's better to remain silent, when her gaze must drop before someone looks at her. Silence has become her second language. Sometimes she catches herself listening to the house, how it breathes, how it reacts to her. If a day passes without remarks, then everything is right. If the silence becomes denser than usual, then a mistake has been made somewhere, even if invisible. On those days, Aisha tries to be even quieter. That night is remembered here rarely, but with certainty, not as humiliation, as a beginning. After that, everything fell into place, someone says in the kitchen. That's when it became clear the family was strong, another adds. The words, a proper beginning, sound like a blessing. Aisha hears them without turning around. She knows. This story does not belong to her. It belongs to the house. And the house needs the story to be smooth, without cracks. Samir lives by the rules of the family. He is neither cruel nor affectionate. He is precise. He leaves on time, returns on time, eats in silence, sleeps turned away. Sometimes he asks questions, short, practical ones. Sometimes he says thank you, just as briefly. There are no arguments between them, but there is no closeness either. There is agreement with order. It's calmer this way, he says when Aisha asks with her eyes whether she can change something. She nods. Calm is a convincing reason. Her mother-in-law watches as always, from a distance. She approaches when necessary and leaves without sound. Sometimes she offers praise, quiet, emotionless. The house is satisfied, she says. Aisha accepts it as a mark of compliance. The years pass. Aisha does not count them. She counts rituals, holidays, visits, repetitions. The memory of who she once was grows thin, like an old photograph. The face is familiar but distant. Sometimes Aisha remembers laughter. Anne cannot tell whether it was hers. Children appear in the house. Aisha cares for them attentively, without displaying excess emotion. She teaches them rules before words, shows them how to sit, how to listen, how not to interrupt. She does it gently, the way it was once done to her. There is bitterness in it, but also necessity. Here, those who know boundaries survive. When the children grow older, the women speak of that night again, now as a legend. That's when everything took its place, they say with smiles. Aisha hears this and keeps kneading the dough. Her hands remember better than her mind. Sometimes, late in the evening, she goes out into the courtyard. She sits on the steps and looks at the sky. There are no answers there, but there is space. In those moments, Aisha feels alive, not free, but alive. That is enough to return to the house and continue. She is not beaten. She is not humiliated out loud. She is not driven away. She is allowed to stay, and this allowed to stay requires a daily payment. Silence, precision, the absence of desire. Aisha pays. She knows how. One day her mother-in-law approaches and says almost tenderly, "You are a good mistress of the house. That's how it should be." Aisha nods. She knows should is the most important word in this house. At night, Samir lies down beside her without touching her. The house falls asleep. Aisha closes her eyes and does not wait for dreams. Dreams, too, are a choice, and choices are not encouraged here. She is alive, and that is everything.